Do you know what happened to the famous tyrant Adolf Hitler? Was his body ever found? In a dramatic turn of events, the details surrounding Adolf Hitler's death are still a mystery today. As the Third Reich fell, Soviet soldiers entered Hitler's bunker, marking not only the downfall of a tyrannical regime, but also the death of its notorious leader. Yet, even after 80 years, we still have unanswered questions. Some believe Hitler chose to be killed rather than surrendering, but others aren't so sure. Join us as we uncover a startling discovery about Hitler's body that changed everything.
Chapter 1. The Final Days of Hitler. As the Allies closed in on Berlin in April 1945, the atmosphere within the Führerbunker, an underground refuge beneath the Reich Chancellery, grew increasingly suffocating. Adolf Hitler, the man who had once held Europe in a grip of terror, now faced the inevitable collapse of his empire. The final days of Hitler are a narrative of paranoia, desperation, and the ultimate act of cowardice. Hitler felt deeply betrayed and knew he was losing in his final moments. The Soviet army was coming from the east, and the Allies were moving into Germany from the west. Inside the bunker, a small version of a collapsing regime, Hitler's paranoia escalated. He was informed of the defection and surrender of his closest allies, which only deepened his despair. During a very confusing and difficult time, Hitler made some final choices. He married Eva Braun, who had been his girlfriend for a long time, in a quick wedding that happened inside his underground shelter. This union, coming at the world's end for the Nazi regime, was a bizarre testament to the personal delusions Hitler clung to, even as his world crumbled. Following their marriage, Hitler, with grim determination, dictated his last will and testament, a document that combined self-pity with delusional justifications for his actions. It was a final attempt to shape his legacy, even in the face of overwhelming defeat. The decision to end their lives was made. Hitler and Braun chose suicide over capture, a choice that symbolized their refusal to face the consequences of their actions. On April 30th, 1945, after saying their farewells to the few remaining loyalists, the couple retreated to their private quarters. According to accounts from those inside the bunker, Hitler consumed a cyanide capsule before shooting himself, while Braun took cyanide. The aftermath was chaotic. Loyal aides carried out Hitler's orders to ensure his body and that of Braun would not become trophies for the Allies. The bodies were carried upstairs through the Reich Chancellery garden and set ablaze in a shell crater. This crude cremation, conducted under the relentless bombardment of Berlin, was a macabre and hastily arranged funeral. Yet even the fire could not obliterate the legacy of terror Hitler had wrought. The Soviet forces would soon enter Berlin, finding the charred remains and beginning the process of identification. The initial discovery did little to quell the rampant speculation and conspiracy theories that would emerge over the following decades. Stalin, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity in the ambiguity surrounding Hitler's death. By casting doubt on the Führer's fate, he could sow confusion among the Allies and perhaps maintain a grip on the narrative of the war's ending. The story of how Hitler died begins with a tale full of secrets, doubts, and a defeated country's desperate hope. The bunker, a tight space filled with concrete and sadness, was where the last part of a very dark chapter in history happened. Hitler's death didn't end the story of the Third Reich. Instead, it started a lot of questions and guesses that people talked about for many years. People asked if Hitler really died in that bunker, or if he escaped, leaving someone else to trick the Allies. There wasn't a clear grave, and the way he died was mysterious, which made people wonder a lot. This part of history mixes real facts and made-up stories, showing how much people are still interested in what happened in Hitler's last days. The end of the Nazi leader is still something people look at closely and talk about a lot. Looking closer at what happened before that important day in the bunker, we see not just the end of a cruel leader, but also the lasting effects of his rule. Still, the body of Hitler remained missing from the public eye for decades, and nobody could figure out where it was. Chapter 2. What happened to Hitler's corpse? After Hitler ended his life on April 30th, 1945, some of his loyal followers had to deal with the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun. Outside, Berlin was almost destroyed. The city, once the center of the Nazi rule, was now just broken buildings and streets under attack. In this terrible setting, the last act of loyalty to Hitler was to make sure the Allies didn't show off his body. They had to quickly figure out what to do with Hitler's body. Witnesses say Hitler wanted his body and Braun's to be burned so no one could disrespect them later. Following his orders, their bodies, covered in blankets, were carried upstairs to a garden. There, the small group of followers, knowing they were part of a sad and important moment, poured petrol over the bodies and set them on fire. It was a tough thing to do, and the scene was very strange as they watched the bodies burn. They stood quietly, only hearing the distant sounds of the Soviet army getting closer and the loud noises of bombs. The fire was a Russian effort to destroy the body of a man whose actions caused the deaths of millions and ruined much of Europe. But even as the fire burned the bodies, the situation was uncertain and done in a hurry, showing the messy end of the Nazi rule. The first attempt to burn the bodies wasn't completely successful. The outdoor fire wasn't hot enough to fully burn them. What was left were partly burned remains, looking very unsettling, far from the total destruction Hitler had wanted. After trying to burn the bodies, they were quickly buried in a shallow hole made by a bomb, near where they tried to burn them. This quick burial was just a temporary fix, chosen because of the urgent situation. Berlin was about to fall, and the Soviet army was getting closer, so the people in the bunker didn't have much time to think of a better plan. The place where they buried the remains was plain, trying to hide the remains in the ruined area around the Reich Chancellery Garden. But even as they tried to remove all traces of Hitler, they ended up making a hidden grave that would soon catch the Soviet forces' interest as they moved through Berlin. When the Soviet soldiers found Hitler's remains, it made the story of how Hitler died even more mysterious. These Soviet troops knew they had found something very important, so they quickly dug up the remains to look at them more closely. This was just the start of many secret things the Soviet government did under Stalin's orders. Stalin wanted to be the one to tell the story of how Hitler died. Getting rid of Hitler's body was done quickly and in a very messy and confused way. It shows just how much chaos there was when Hitler's government, the Third Reich, was coming to an end. The people who tried to burn Hitler's body and then bury it were still loyal to him. Even though everything was falling apart, they wanted to do what Hitler had asked for his body. But what they didn't really work. The remains, which were only partly burned and buried in a hurry, started a lot of arguments, guesses, and secrets that lasted for many years. Chapter 3. Where is the body? People have always been curious about what really happened to Hitler's body after it was first buried. This curiosity has led to many different stories and a lot of research. Since no one knows exactly where Hitler's body ended up, and the Soviet leaders kept things very secret, the story of what happened to Hitler's remains is still very interesting and confusing to a lot of people. The way Hitler's body was treated in such a rush shows how quickly his government collapsed. The people who were still loyal to him tried to follow his last wishes by burning and burying his body. But they didn't do a very good job. The remains were only half burned and were buried without much care. This has led to a lot of different ideas and mysteries over the years. The big question of what really happened to Hitler's body after it was first put in the ground has made many people come up with different theories and do a lot of research to find out the truth. The fact that there's no clear place where Hitler's body ended up and that the Soviet leaders kept so many secrets means that the story of Hitler's remains is still something that a lot of people find very interesting and hard to understand. When we look back at what happened after Hitler died and how the Soviets dealt with his body, we see a really complicated story. It's full of true events, guesses, and people's ongoing interest in Hitler, who was one of the most infamous people in history. This part of history involves the Soviets finding Hitler's body and something called the Stalin paradox. So, let's imagine the scene. It's just after World War II, and the city of Berlin is in ruins. The Soviet Union's army, known as the Red Army, has taken over the city. They find the body of Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany during the war. This was a big deal because Hitler was responsible for so much tragedy during the war. The Soviet Union, led by a tough leader named Joseph Stalin, was now in the spotlight for making this huge discovery. But the story of how they found Hitler and what they did with his body is full of secrets, lies, and confusion. This is what people mean when they talk about the Stalin paradox. Stalin, who was the boss of the Soviet Union, really wanted to catch Hitler alive. He thought that bringing Hitler to justice would show the whole world how strong and important the Soviet Union was after the war. So, when the Soviet soldiers found Hitler's body, which was not in good shape and was in a small hole made by a bomb behind a big government building, it was a mixed bag of feelings for Stalin and his team. On one hand, they could finally prove that Hitler was indeed dead, which was important for many reasons. But on the other hand, Stalin lost the chance to show off the capture of Hitler to the world. Now let's dive deeper into this story. It's important to understand the mood of the world just after World War II. People were tired, sad, and trying to understand all the terrible things that had happened. The Soviet Union, like many other countries, had suffered a lot during the war. So finding Hitler was not just about winning a battle, it was about closing a painful chapter in history. The Red Army's search for Hitler was intense. They knew that finding him, dead or alive, would send a powerful message. When they finally found his body, it was a big moment. It showed that even the most powerful and feared leaders could fall. But because the body was in such bad shape, there were doubts and questions about whether it really was Hitler. This added to the mystery and confusion about what really happened to him. The Soviet Union kept a lot of details about Hitler's death and what they did with his body secret for many years. This secrecy led to many stories and theories. Some people thought Hitler had escaped, others thought the Soviets were hiding something big. The truth was hard to find because Stalin's government controlled the information very tightly. This historical period is fascinating because it shows how complicated things can get when politics, war, and powerful personalities mix. The story of Hitler's death and the Soviet handling of his remains is not just about those events. It's also about how people, governments, and history itself can create a web of stories, truths, and secrets. It's a reminder that history is often about what happened and how we understand and remember those events. Chapter 4: The Disturbing Stalin Paradox on Hitler's Body. When the Soviet Union first responded to Hitler's death, they kept a lot of things secret. They quickly put together a team of experts who looked closely at the evidence, like dental records, to figure out if the bodies they found were really Hitler and Eva Braun. They did find strong evidence, but Stalin, the Soviet leader, decided to tell the public that he wasn't sure if Hitler was really dead. This started a confusing story that Stalin would use in different ways for a long time. Stalin's choice not to admit Hitler was dead had several reasons behind it. For one, it let the Soviet Union keep people unsure and worried. They could say that the danger from the Nazis was still around, which helped them justify why their army stayed in Eastern Europe. It was also a way to mess with the minds of their allies in the West. It made it seem like these allies either couldn't catch Hitler or let him get away on purpose. Stalin's tricky way of handling this made people everywhere start to guess and come up with conspiracy theories. They wondered if Hitler might have somehow lived and run away. These doubts grew because no one saw Hitler's body, and Stalin kept hinting at things without giving clear answers. The secretive way the Soviets did their investigation also helped these rumors grow. People started to think maybe Hitler was still leading the Nazis from a secret place. This situation was complex and had a lot of layers. Stalin's game of keeping secrets and spreading doubts had a big impact. It wasn't just about keeping people guessing about Hitler. It was also about power and control. By not clearing up the mystery, Stalin kept everyone, including his own people and other countries, on their toes. They couldn't be sure what had happened, and this uncertainty strengthened Stalin's position. He used this uncertainty to his advantage in many ways. For example, by keeping the Nazi threat alive in people's minds, Stalin made it easier for the Soviet Union to control Eastern Europe. They could say they were protecting people from Nazis who might still be out there. At the same time, he made the Western countries look bad. It seemed like they either didn't do their job right or had secret deals with Hitler. This kind of thinking made people not trust each other, which was something Stalin could use to his advantage in the complicated politics of the time. The mix of secrets, half-truths, and rumors created a confusing and tense atmosphere that lasted for years and affected how countries interacted with each other. The Stalin paradox was not just about denying Hitler's death, it was much more complex and misleading. Stalin, the Soviet leader, didn't just say Hitler was dead. Instead, he spread rumors and conspiracy theories that Hitler might still be alive. He suggested that Hitler could be hiding in places like Spain or Argentina. These countries were known for giving shelter to Nazis who ran away after the war. The Soviets made these rumors seem more believable by not sharing solid proof of Hitler's death with their allies. This lack of evidence made the mystery about what really happened to Hitler even deeper. As time went on, this Stalin paradox kept changing and growing. The Cold War was getting more intense, but the story that Hitler might still be alive stayed useful for Soviet propaganda. It was a trick to confuse and split up people's opinions, both in the Soviet Union and in other countries. The Soviets used these fake stories as part of their bigger plan to play mind games. They wanted to shake the confidence of Western countries and make them less united. What's really lasting about the Stalin paradox is how it left people unsure and still curious about what happened to Hitler's body. Even though there's a lot of evidence that shows Hitler didn't survive, these escape and survival stories are still talked about by many people, from everyday folks to those who believe in more unlikely theories. When the Soviets first found Hitler's remains, it could have been the end of the story about the Nazi leader, but instead, it was just the beginning of a more tangled tale. Chapter 5. Another terrifying theory. After World War II ended, there was a lot of confusion and disagreement about what happened to Adolf Hitler's body. People were trying to figure out if he really died and how it happened. This story became very complicated because different groups, especially the Soviet Union, did their own investigations and sometimes didn't agree. We're going to explore these investigations, why there were disagreements, and how people tried to solve the mystery of what happened to Hitler at the end of the war. Right after the war, the Soviet soldiers found some burned remains outside the bunker where Hitler was last seen. They started looking into these remains to see if they were Hitler's. Their main clues were some teeth, pieces of a skull, and a few things that belonged to Hitler. Soviet experts looked closely at the teeth and said they matched what they knew about Hitler's dental work. Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blasicki, and his assistant, who had escaped to the West, had given information about Hitler's teeth, and the Soviets said the teeth they found matched this information. But people were suspicious because the Soviets kept a lot of secrets and didn't let experts from other countries check their work. The mystery got even more confusing when they found a piece of skull with a hole from a bullet. This seemed to support the story that Hitler shot himself while also taking poison. But during the Cold War, the Soviet Union didn't share much information and didn't let others see the evidence they had. This secrecy made people doubt the Soviet story. Many people started to think of different theories, including the idea that Hitler might have escaped and survived. There were some problems with the reports about the pieces of a skull and questions about whether the teeth studies were done right, which made things more confusing. In the 1970s and 1980s, when new ways to study forensics came up, more people wanted to look at the evidence again. Then, in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, researchers and historians could finally get to records and stuff that they couldn't see before. The big change in figuring out these problems happened when modern forensic science got better. In 2009, researchers from America got to look at the skull pieces that were in the Russian State Archive and were said to be Hitler's. But when they checked the DNA, they found out it was actually from a woman who was younger than 40. This made people really doubt what the Soviets had said about these skull pieces proving Hitler died. Because of this, people had to think again about what the forensic evidence really showed, and they started to look more at Hitler's teeth. which seemed to be the most reliable thing to connect to him. In 2017, French experts who know a lot about teeth got to look at Hitler's dental remains that the Russian State Archive kept. They found out that the earlier studies were right. The dental work matched what Hitler's dentist had said, making it pretty clear that Hitler did die in his bunker in 1945. These teeth, along with stories from that time and what was happening around the bunker, gave the strongest proof that Hitler really died. Even though they were wrong about the skull pieces, the evidence from the teeth was still solid. Looking into Hitler's remains has shown how hard it can be to figure out what happened in history and how new technology can help us understand the past better. The problems and different stories over the years show not just how tricky forensic science can be, but also how people's political and personal views can make it hard to understand what evidence is really saying. The staying power of false beliefs about historical events. Even though there is a lot of historical and scientific proof about what happened to Adolf Hitler, false stories about him surviving and getting away are still around in the 21st century. These stories didn't just come from nowhere. They are kept alive by many things, including wrong information spread by the Soviet Union, how mysterious and evil Hitler was, and people's interest in thinking about what if different things had happened in history. Chapter 6. Dead Body Missing. Adolf Hitler is a name that most people know, and for a very bad reason. He's known as one of the worst people in history because of the terrible things he did during World War II and the Holocaust. Many people have studied him because they are shocked and interested in how someone can do such evil things. Hitler did so many awful things that some people think of him as more than just a person, almost like a bad character in a story. When you think of really bad villains, you might expect them to have a dramatic ending. That's why some people find it hard to believe that Hitler just died in a simple way, hidden in a bunker under Berlin. They think someone as famous and evil as Hitler should have had a more exciting end to his life. Some people like to think that Hitler was clever enough to escape and live the rest of his life without anyone knowing. This idea is like a story that is more interesting than what really happened. People love mysteries and asking what-if questions. Since there are some things we don't know for sure about Hitler's death, it's easy for people to make up stories and guess about what might have happened. These made-up stories about Hitler are popular because people like to hear different versions of history, especially ones that sound more exciting or complicated than what most people believe. There are a lot of books, movies, and TV shows that talk about these what-if stories about Hitler. These stories make people even more interested and keep the mystery alive. They reach a lot of people and make them think about these other possibilities. It's interesting how stories and ideas like this can keep going, even when there's no real proof. When something is mysterious or unknown, people's imaginations start to work, and they come up with all sorts of ideas. Hitler's life and death are a big part of history, so it's natural that people are curious and want to know more, even if it means imagining different ways things could have happened. Conspiracy theories are like interesting stories that grab people's attention and become popular topics for movies and TV shows. This makes them more widely known and talked about. When we look at these theories from the view of psychology, we find that they help people understand and deal with the complex and unpredictable world. For example, some people believe that Hitler didn't die but lived in secret. This kind of thinking comes from our human desire to find patterns and stories in big events that help us feel like we have some control or understanding. These theories also help people deal with the heavy emotions and trauma from big historical events like World War II and the Holocaust. They provide a way to think about and process these difficult parts of history. It's not just about Hitler. Throughout history, there have been many famous people whose deaths or disappearances have been surrounded by mystery and speculation. These mysteries catch the public's interest and show how much people are fascinated by unresolved stories from the past. Two other famous examples are Amelia Earhart and the Romanov family. Their stories are mixed with both truth and fiction, much like the theories about Hitler's end. Amelia Earhart was a famous pilot who disappeared in 1937 while trying to fly around the world. Even after many searches, No one knows exactly what happened to her or where her plane ended up. This has led to many different theories, like her being captured or living a new life under a different name. These cases, like Hitler's, show how people are drawn to unsolved mysteries and enjoy trying to figure out what really happened. Just like the theories about Hitler, the missing pieces in Amelia Earhart's story let people's imaginations create all sorts of ideas and theories. Whenever a new hint or bit of information comes up, it sparks fresh interest in her story. The mystery surrounding what happened to Earhart keeps her name and story talked about and remembered long after she vanished. Similarly, the story of the Romanov family, the last royal family of Russia, draws a lot of attention. After the Russian Revolution, the last Tsar, Nicholas II, his wife, and their children were all gone in 1918. But for many years, there were rumors and stories that some family members, especially the Grand Duchess Anastasia, might have survived. Lots of women came forward saying they were Anastasia, hoping to get the Romanov family's wealth. This led to many court cases and a lot of public interest. It wasn't until much later, with DNA testing, that scientists could finally identify the remains of the Romanovs, putting an end to most of the guesses and stories. Yet, their story, like Hitler's, shows how mysteries can live on when there's no clear proof. These mysteries keep people interested and offer different ways of looking at history that go against what's usually believed. In both cases, these stories capture our imagination because they have unanswered questions and the possibility of different endings. They let us think about what-if scenarios, which are always interesting. The idea that someone like Amelia Earhart might have had a completely different life after her disappearance, or that a member of the Romanov family might have escaped and lived secretly, adds a sense of adventure and intrigue to history. These stories also show how people like to connect with the past. When we hear about these mysteries, we feel a link to history and the people who lived through these events. It's like being a detective in a historical mystery, trying to piece together clues from long ago. This detective work is not just for fun. It also helps us understand history better and think about how events from the past still impact us today. Furthermore, these unsolved mysteries teach us about how history is recorded and remembered. They remind us that history is not always clear-cut, and that sometimes what we take as truth might have more to it. They encourage us to keep asking questions, to be curious, and to look deeper into the stories we are told about the past. In a way, these mysteries keep history alive and evolving, as each generation brings new perspectives and questions to these enduring enigmas. Amelia Earhart, the Romanov family, and Adolf Hitler's stories have a lot in common. First, they were all very important in history. Earhart was a trailblazer in flying, the Romanovs were Russian royalty, and Hitler is known for his infamous role in World War II. Because they were so famous, people are really interested in the unanswered questions about what happened to them. So, what do you think happened to Hitler? Let us know in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more.